17th Congress last year with a hearing on global climate trends that established a baseline of facts for our work to address climate change through innovation while maintaining affordable and reliable power and American energy independence. What we've achieved over the past year reflects that imperative. We came together to develop and pass the Bipartisan Energy Infrastructure Act, which has now been signed into law as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We getting the feedback? This once-in-a-generation investment in the nation's infrastructure includes crucial funding to advance carbon capture utilization, sequestration and removal, hydrogen and critical minerals and battery recycling, upgrading transmission infrastructure, and modernizing the electric grid, energy efficiency and weatherization, cleaning up and developing clean energy on abandoned mine lands and orphan wells, and so much more. In total, the committee held 40 full committee and subcommittee hearings, as well as 10 business meetings, where we reported out the Energy Infrastructure Bill and 24 pieces of public lands legislation, and we advanced 19 of President Biden's nominees. I look forward to another productive year ahead for this committee, working together across the aisles we've become known for to do important work for the American people. With that, I will now turn to today's hearing topic of hydropower. Hydropower is one of the oldest sources of power generation in the country, and until 2019, it was also the largest source of renewable generation. In 2020, hydropower provided over 7% of the total U.S. electricity generation, coming in fifth behind natural gas, nuclear, coal, and wind. Unlike most other renewable energy resources, hydropower generation provides baseload electricity. It's also flexible, which means the generation capacity is available when we need it, and it has the ability to respond to changing grid conditions and adjust output accordingly. That makes hydropower unique and valuable for maintaining grid reliability as more intermittent resources come online. Given the baseload attributes of hydropower, we need to make sure our existing capacity remains operational. Much of the nation's hydropower is generated at large federal dams operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Land Reclamation. I'm pleased that we have Commissioner of Reclamation, Camille Tutun, here to discuss how reclamation, as the second largest hydropower producer, is tackling this challenge. One of the greatest challenges for non-federal hydropower operators is the extensive cost of upgrades and improvements that many facilities need in order to be brought in line with federal standards. Between now and 2030, 281 facilities that represent nearly 14 gigawatts of hydropower generation and pumped storage hydropower capacity are up for FERC relicensing, which is close to a third of all U.S. non-federal hydropower capacity. Between low hydroelectricity prices and the high capital cost of maintenance and retrofits required for relicensing, there is a real possibility that many of these plants could face closure. A 2021 report from the Department of Energy cited cost of necessary upgrades and improvements as a leading factor in many operators' decisions to surrender their licenses. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that President Biden signed into law in November made a historic investment in new and existing incentives for new hydropower production, efficiency upgrades, and infrastructure and environmental improvements. The bill also included $8.2 billion for Western water infrastructure at the Bureau of Reclamation, which included investments in aging infrastructure and hydropower facilities. These resources will help to ensure that we keep vital hydropower capacity online. I know agencies are only beginning to get these resources out the door, but I look forward to hearing from our panel about how they view these investments. Finally, in addition to maintaining our existing hydropower, most of which is located in the West, we also have an opportunity to develop new hydropower generation and pump storage hydropower resources in the West and in other regions. Less than 3% of the dams in the U.S. produce power, leaving thousands that were built for flood control or irrigation that could be retrofitted for hydropower, including several that the Army Corps has identified in my state of West Virginia. In 2012, Oak Ridge National Laboratory did an assessment of non-powered dams in the U.S. and determined that there is at least 12 gigawatts of untapped hydropower potential. Development of non-powered dams and new pump storage hydropower systems can support additional intermittent renewable generation and create many new, well-paying jobs. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the need to maintain and grow this very valuable resource and the challenges that we face in doing so. With that, I'm going to turn to Senator Barrasso for his opening remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks so much for holding this important hearing, because we are once again discussing the need for affordable, reliable, and resilient energy. Before turning to today's hearing topic, I'd like to address a letter that dozens of Democrats sent to the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They did it last week. And it was interesting because it was in yesterday's Wall Street Journal under the headline, "No Climate Warriors in Frozen Foxholes." I'll show this to you, Mr. Chairman, because like the Wall Street Journal, I found it ridiculous that there are members of Congress, members of the Senate, who have worked to undermine our nation's ability to produce natural gas, and they are now expressing their concern about its high prices. These are the same members who want to impose a new natural gas tax on American families. They're the same members who oppose new domestic natural gas production. And they include many Northeastern members who oppose new pipelines, which would give their own states access to some of the nation's cheapest natural gas, specifically natural gas from West Virginia. If these Democrats want to reduce energy prices, they need to work with Republicans to make it easier, not more difficult, to produce American energy. That includes developing and using all forms of energy, which brings us to the topic of today's hearing, which you brought together these experts, Mr. Chairman. Because hydropower does produce more than 7% of our nation's electricity. It's critical. Until recently, hydropower was our nation's largest source of renewable energy. Unlike other sources of renewable energy, hydropower is available when it is needed. That means that hydroelectric dams can provide power whether it is day or night, whether the wind is blowing, the sun is shining, no matter what. Hydropower can once again be our largest source of renewable energy if we maintain our existing hydroelectric dams and encourage the installation of turbines on our nation's non-powered dams. Because, Mr. Chairman, the overwhelming majority of our dams do not produce any hydropower. More than 90,000 dams exist, yet fewer than 2,300 produce electricity. Well, that's less than 3%. Clearly, not every dam is well suited to energy generation. There are many important considerations beyond energy production. These include preserving and enhancing recreation, farming, ranching, wildlife habitat. But with only 3% of our dams producing energy, that does leave a lot of room for growth. According to the Department of Energy, installing turbines on some of these dams would provide at least 12 gigawatts of additional electricity. Well, that's enough renewable energy electricity to power 9 million homes. Growing our nation's hydropower capacity would help our country reduce or avoid new greenhouse gas emissions. It would also increase the reliability and resiliency of our nation's electric grids. Now, this is especially important in light of the blackout events in California and across the Midwest in recent years. Hydropower can be used to repower an electric grid which has collapsed. This is known as a black start capability. To provide this service, an electric generation unit cannot rely on any power from the collapsed grid. The Texas grid came dangerously close to requiring a black start last year. Roughly 40% of the electric generating units which are maintained for black start services are hydropower units. That's why they're so critical. This attribute makes hydropower a particularly attractive resource in light of the increasing threats to the electric grid from cyber attacks. Hydropower is clearly an important component of an all-of-the-above energy strategy. We should encourage more hydropower generation, and if we're going to grow our nation's hydropower capacity, we must address the permitting process. This is especially important for utilities which are deciding whether or not to relicense existing hydropower units. Streamlining the permitting process is also necessary to promote the installation of hydropower turbines on some of these non-powered dams. Currently, hydropower faces one of the most complex and time-consuming permitting processes. The glacial pace of permitting is a significant barrier to private sector investment in hydropower. It reduces the likelihood of investment in upgrading existing hydropower facilities as well and installing turbines on non-powered dams. According to 2017 testimony of one hydropower developer, quote, "The timeline for a new hydropower development project to reach commercial operation is between 10 and 13 years, which is almost unmatched in the power generation space. Goes on to say most of this time is taken by permitting, not by construction, by permitting. Well, little has changed since 2017, and for that reason, I encourage this committee to explore meaningful reforms to the hydropower licensing process. To do that, the committee should also get input from the FERC and additional agencies within the Department of Interior on this topic. And I hope we can do that soon, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you again for holding this important hearing, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the witnesses. I look forward to the testimony on the topic. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. I'd like to turn to our panel of witnesses. And with us, we have Ms. Jennifer Garson, Acting Director of the Water Power Technologies Office at the Department of Energy, who is joining us virtually today. Ms. Camille Tootin, the Commissioner of Reclamation, who is also with us virtually. Mr. Scott Corwin, Executive Director of the Northwest Public Power Association, and Mr. Malcolm Wolf, President and CEO of the National Hydropower Association. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And Ms. Garson, we'll begin with your opening remarks.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Jennifer Garson, and I'm the Acting Director for the Water Power Technologies Office in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. As Acting Director, I direct applied research, development, demonstration, and deployment activities for the Water Power Technologies Office. Hydropower has provided clean, low-cost electricity for over a century. In 2020, hydropower provided 7.2% of the electricity on the grid, accounting for 37% of renewable electricity generation. And pumped storage is the largest contributor to U.S. energy storage, including the largest source of commercially available long-duration energy storage. Today's evolving power system has created new opportunities for hydropower to play an important role in a 100% clean energy future, using existing and new technologies and infrastructure. Hydropower, including pumped storage, provides key services to support the integration of variable renewable energy resources. Through modernization of the existing U.S. hydropower fleet, adapting to the changing needs of our nation's power system, and meeting the challenges of climate change head-on, hydropower can be a keystone to a fully decarbonized power system by 2035. However, the U.S. hydropower fleet contains some of the oldest electricity generation facilities in the world, and it will continue to require innovations and investments to meet the evolving needs of the grid. Additionally, much of the fleet is up for relicensing over the coming decades, representing an immediate need to both measure and evaluate hydropower's role on the grid. And while there are opportunities to expand and deploy more hydropower, including a significant pipeline of pumped storage, significant challenges exist in bringing new facilities on the grid. DOE recognizes the need for a robust hydropower research, investment, and innovation in existing and potential new hydropower resources. The Water Power Office administers a broad portfolio of research activities and supports industry efforts to maintain, develop, and deploy new hydropower. These efforts are directly aligned with the Biden administration's goal of a carbon pollution-free electricity sector by 2035. With the advent of a greater level of variable renewable energy generation on the U.S. grid, hydropower's role is more critical than ever. Our HydroWires initiative, launched in 2019, addresses both the existing and future roles of hydropower in serving the grid. The goal of this work is to fund the analysis and technologies to understand, enable, and improve hydropower and pump storage's contribution to reliability, resiliency, and integration into the rapidly evolving U.S. electricity system. The Water Power Office also develops new technologies, tools, and data to understand and improve the environmental performance of hydropower facilities. These advancements help inform and streamline the environmental evaluations and studies associated with the licensing process, and make it easier and more cost-effective to mitigate any long-term impacts of operations. Our work focuses on fish passage and migration, water quality and water release management, and we're building the analytical capabilities to better understand and quantify the hydrologic impacts of climate change on the fleet. Our office also supports the development of technologies and analysis to develop new low-impact hydropower to power non-power dams for infrastructure. This includes evaluating adding hydro to existing infrastructure to support multiple benefits, such as irrigation modernization to serve agricultural end users. Community-centric development is a critical emphasis of our work, particularly in the instances of remote, underserved, tribal, and isolated communities. These communities are deeply reliant on and connected to their water systems as part of their economy and culture. Recognizing and being respectful of these factors, we endeavor to build connections to communities as well as industries who use the technologies developed through our funding. And with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Water Power Technologies Office will administer almost $800 million to support adding capacity to non-powered dams, investing in efficiency gains at existing facilities, and address grid capabilities, environmental improvements, and dam safety in our nation's non-federal hydropower fleet. This historic level of funding for these programs will have an immediate impact on the U.S. hydropower sector and help address some of the critical capital gaps that industry faces in making key improvements for hydropower to continue to serve the grid. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. I look forward to working with you to address both the challenges and opportunities for hydropower and pump storage while ensuring equitable access to low cost and reliable and resilient clean energy. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Garson. Now we'll have Commissioner Tootin.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, good morning and Happy New Year. First, thank you for consideration of my nomination in support of my confirmation. And I am honored to be joining you today as the Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, the second largest producer of hydropower in the country. Hydropower is unique. It is a baseload deployable resource with black start capability. My remarks today summarize my testimony and focus on Reclamation's efforts to protect, enhance, and promote hydropower and the challenges that we face because of drought. Hydropower production in an environmentally responsible manner is an important source of renewable energy and supports the administration and the department's goals of clean energy and climate change initiatives. The development of hydropower across the West has created significant benefits. It also has significantly impacted the environment in the riverine communities, including tribal communities. The reclamation of the 21st century continues to recognize the value of hydropower while also working with our partners on solutions to these challenges. On average, reclamation produces enough power equivalent to the demand of 3.7 million homes annually, produces $1 billion in power revenues, and displaces approximately 1.7 million a million tons of carbon dioxide. But our fleet is aging. To ensure the continued reliability, efficiency, and safety of our aging hydropower assets, Reclamation continues to look for opportunities to upgrade and modernize. Since 2009, Reclamation has replaced 35 turbines. This has allowed for an additional 340 million kilowatt hours annually. During that same period, we've upgraded 6 generators, increasing capacity by 40,000 kilowatts. Last month, Reclamation and Bonneville Power Administration completed the overhaul of several generating units inside the Nat Washington Power Plant in Grand Coulee Dam, the largest hydropower facility in the nation. Reclamation is committed to facilitating the development of non-federal hydropower at our existing federal facilities. In 2020, Reclamation signed the Federal Hydropower MOU with the Department of Energy and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Coupled with our hydropower strategic plan, we ensure hydropower remains cost competitive while delivering value to our customers and stakeholders. Through our streamlined lease of power privilege permitting process, Reclamation is facilitating the development of non-federal renewable hydropower on our existing federal projects. And currently, 14 facilities operate on Reclamation projects, 10 that were brought online since 2009. Western hydropower faces tremendous challenges due to the unprecedented drought, and most prominently seen in the Colorado River Basin. Lakes Mead and Powell are at the lowest since initial filling. In the lower basin, as Lake Mead's elevation drops, effectiveness of Hoover Dam turbines are reduced. So in 2017, Reclamation replaced 5 of the 17 power generating turbines with what's called wide head turbines, creating efficiencies at lower lake levels. Reclamation also signed an MOU with the lower basin states to collectively conserve 1 million acre feet of water over the next 2 years at Lake Mead and keep that water in Lake Mead. In the upper basin, hydropower production at Glen Canyon Dam has dropped about 16%. Recent forecasts show the possibility of Lake Powell dropping below a designated target elevation of 35-25 feet as early as next month. This elevation is critical because it is just 35 feet above the minimum power pool elevation of 3490. Extremely dry hydrology combined with low reservoir levels means new and unpredictable operational conditions at Glen Canyon Dam, among others. And Reclamation is working with our Upper Basin partners to protect elevations at Lake Powell. But we cannot do this alone. Working together is the best way to protect our water and power resources across the West. While challenges exist, so do opportunities through investments under the bipartisan infrastructure law, which includes new pump storage authorities for reclamation. Thank you for the leadership of this committee for including reclamation as part of this law. And we anticipate the release of our FY22 infrastructure spend plan later this month. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our work. I'd also like to recognize Max Spiker and our hydropower team in Denver and across the regions for their work on this issue. Reclamation is committed to meeting our mission of delivering water and producing hydropower, and I am pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now we have Mr. Cord.
There. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for holding this hearing on. While hydropower is one of our oldest forms of generating electricity, it's also a resource for the future, renewable, emission-free, and has the flexible capacity to add stability to the grid at critical times. NWPPA's members, Northwest Public Power Association, are consumer-owned electric utilities in the West and use a wide mix of generation resources. Many, like Lower Valley Energy in Jackson, Wyoming, rely significantly on hydropower, consisting multi-purpose dams that are critical not just for power, but also for transportation, irrigation, flood control, water supply, and recreation. Losing any part of this network can be devastating to communities and destabilize their electricity. While hydropower provides as much as 90% of electricity capacity in some areas we serve, there's only 7% of capacity nationally. Why? Public policy and market design has not kept up with the need, and it's a need that is very real in regions adding types of generation resources that do not have adequate storage and flexibility, where hydropower can provide reliability through services like spinning reserves. One challenge for hydropower is that traditional energy markets were not designed to provide proper price signals for its values, like ramping capacity and ancillary services. We need more market mechanisms that can create price formation to compensate hydropower so it's available for dispatch when needed most. Another challenge is that hydropower has not received the same financial incentives as other sources. I'd like to thank Senators Cantwell and Murkowski for introducing S 2306 to create a 30% clean energy tax credit to support upgrades at existing hydropower projects. Importantly, it does include a direct pay option, allowing use by cooperatives, municipals, and public utility districts who serve almost a third of all retail customers nationally. Our thanks also to Senator Wyden for his support on this issue and pending tax legislation. We also appreciate Congress acting to fund grant programs for hydropower projects, including pump storage, that can make an enormous difference, especially in rural communities and those not connected to the traditional grid, areas like in Alaska where small projects can have a big impact. In a demonstration of grid resiliency in black start situations, Idaho Falls Power and the Idaho National Lab use new operational approaches to, in effect, create a new microgrid out of small run-of-the-river projects during emergencies. Non-federally owned hydropower, like those small run-of-the-river projects, are subject to FERC licensing and relicensing. So another challenge for hydro is whether projects can navigate this arduous federal process in time to help meet our increasing needs. It's astounding that Energy Northwest, a public power joint operating agency, experienced quicker, more predictable process to renew the license of their 1,200 megawatt nuclear plant than it did for their 27 megawatt hydro project. And that Okanagan County Public Utility District in Washington saw costs triple over a decade before abandoning a proposal to energize an already existing dam. A DOE report on this process released in October noted 90% of projects seeking original licenses are abandoned prior to receiving the license. Members of this committee have led strong efforts to address process delays and costs. Thank you. My full testimony lists other proposals that could really make a difference to eliminate redundancy and delay among federal agencies, such as clearly establishing FERC as a strong lead agency with authority over timelines. A few other areas I note that where the federal government could support hydropower capacity include having FERC allow more operating flexibility so operators like Seattle City Light that see hydrograph changes and critical needs can address those without the unwieldy license amendment process. DOE should continue to support data-driven collaboration by entities like the Hydropower Research Institute to maintain capacity and reduce forced outages. FERC dam safety regulators should not add unnecessary or redundant requests that distract staffing and other resources. And the special use permit process for relocating sediment from U.S. Forest Service land should be amended so operators can get timely resolution to maintain project capacity and safety. With energy policy priorities and system stability hanging in the balance, hydropower is uniquely positioned to lead us into the future if our state and federal policies will allow it to do so by streamlining regulation, creating more equitable incentives, and sending better market signals. Thank you for your leadership in holding this hearing today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. Now, Mr. Wolf.
Thank you.
Just keep talking. We'll tell you if it's on or not.
All right, thank you. It's with great pleasure that I join you today to discuss maintaining and expanding the U.S. hydropower fleet as we work to develop a reliable, affordable, carbon-free electricity grid. While the contribution of hydropower may be underreported in the news, hydropower quietly supplies electricity to power over 30 million homes and businesses, provides 38% of the nation's renewable electricity, delivers 94% of energy storage capacity in the U.S., and provides well-paying jobs to 68,000 professionals. Hydropower also plays an essential role, yet often overlooked role, in enhancing grid reliability by, for example, providing nearly half of the nation's black star capability, which is vital in restarting the grid in the event of a blackout. Mr. Chairman, a few years ago in West Virginia, American Municipal Power started the Willow Island Hydropower Facility near the city of St. Mary's. It was built on an existing non-power dam, which is proof positive that there is ample opportunity for our industry to grow. Ranking Member Barrasso, there are 21 hydropower facilities currently operating in Wyoming, providing about 10% of the state's renewable energy. There's also an ongoing feasibility study for a 900 megawatt Seminole pump storage facility located approximately 30 miles outside of Rawlins, Wyoming. I'm pleased to report that the hydropower industry and our former adversaries, the environmental community, are working together to accelerate the rehabilitation, retrofit, and removal of our nation's more than 90,000 dams. Facilitated by Stanford University's Uncommon Dialogue process, this collaboration points the way for Congress itself to take bipartisan action to advance both the clean energy benefits of hydropower and the environmental benefits of healthy rivers. Let me highlight my 3 specific recommendations to Congress. First, Congress should advance the 3 R's by enacting the pending tax provisions, specifically the Enhancing and Maintaining Hydropower and River Restoration Act, championed by Senator Cantwell and Senator Murkowski, as well as the 21st Century Dam Bill sponsored by Senator Feinstein. A critical down payment towards these goals was included in the recent bipartisan infrastructure package, thanks to the leadership of Chairman Manchin and Senator Portman. Further thanks goes to Senator Wyden and Cantwell for including an environmental improvement tax credit in the pending Build Back Better package with a direct pay for public power. The industry looks forward to working with the Senate and Congress to further clarify these provisions to encourage dam safety, grid resilience, and dam removal. We also urge Congress to enact important tax incentives for new pump storage and an extension of the now expired hydropower and marine energy tax credits and providing these credits at full value. Secondly, Congress needs to address the hydropower license and relicensing process. The uncertainty about the time and cost involved is dramatically at odds with the urgency of addressing climate change and the upcoming wave of hydropower relicensing proceedings, with roughly 30% of the hydropower relicenses expiring in 2030. Relicensing on average takes 7.6 years to complete, with relicensing for many facilities lasting over a decade. At the same time, the paperwork costs associated with relicensing typically exceeds $10 million, with the actual work and upgrades costing many millions more. Not surprisingly, a recent industry survey found that over 1/3 of hydropower owners were actively considering decommissioning a facility. The groups involved in the Uncommon Dialogue are working together to provide the committee a legislative proposal in February that can win bipartisan support, with a goal of enacting such a package before the end of this Congress. Finally, my testimony offers several suggestions to promote renewable generation at existing non-power dams. In supporting funding for DOE, the Corps, and the Bureau, we urge Congress to provide the flexibility these agencies need to hire full-time staff to fulfill their respective missions. As I conclude, let me share just a brief final anecdote. A year ago in New England, a nuclear facility tripped offline, and with it, a staggering 17,000 megawatts of power. The lights in Massachusetts and New Hampshire did not flicker because 2 pump storage facilities quickly dispatched the electricity needed to make up the shortfall. Hydropower is without question an essential part of a climate and clean energy future, and I look forward to working with the committee today.
Thank you, sir. Now we're going to start our questions, and I will begin. And this will go to Ms. Garson and Mr. Wolf if they want to reply. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that was signed into law by President Biden include over $750 million for new and existing incentives to support non-federal hydropower operators. What kind of impact do these incentives have for hydropower operators, particularly those who are or soon will be undergoing FERC relicensing or considering ceasing operations? Do you expect that we can keep them open? Does this do enough, or what more needs to be done? Ms. Garson? Huh?
That's a key question.
Yeah. Ms.
So
Garson?
I can take that first. The $800 million provided, or almost $800 million provided through the infrastructure bill, is a really critical first down payment to providing both investor certainty as well as de-risking some of the projects that are really critical from an environmental, grid, or dam safety perspective. The 247 program, which is new for our office, will make a big difference if we're talking about the distribution of funding. Is going to impact hundreds of projects nationwide. And then for our 242 program and 243, this is increasing efficiency gains at existing hydropower facilities and incentivizing the development of non-powered dams nationwide. So while we are still designing and implementing the program, and it will involve intense stakeholder engagement, we believe that this is a very big and important first step at de-risking some of the investments that are really critical for the services to be kept online.
Mr. Wolf?
Agreed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in getting the bipartisan infrastructure provisions enacted. Those provisions will go a long way in preserving and maintaining the hydropower fleet, but they are just a down payment. We think that money will stretch to cover investments in perhaps 150 to 200 facilities across the nation, but there are about 2,200 in the U.S. So a great down payment, but there's more work to be done.
With so much regulations, Army Corps of Engineers, and all the different things they have to go through for permitting, how interested is the private industry in developing the dams that we've been talking about, that basically the thousands and thousands that could be producing so much more hydropower? Is there an interest in the private sector?
There's significant interest in the private sector in developing non-power dams. It's, as you noted, that there's 97% of dams in this country do not provide power. And if we're going to have a facility, dams, we might as well provide the clean, dispatchable power that's out there. Because it is dispatchable, renewable energy, there is a renewed interest in non-power dams.
What about pump storage? I've had them fail in my state. We've tried like the Dickens and couldn't get through the permitting process.
The permitting process is crazy. You've got so many cooks in the kitchen, none of which have ultimate authority to issue the permits. But there is tremendous interest in pump storage. There's over 50 gigawatts of pump storage in the pipeline. But getting them, no new pump storage has been built in over 20 years in this country. And we're not going to be able to keep the lights on with just wind and solar. We need, or batteries. We need long duration energy storage, which is what pump storage is so great at providing.
I can only imagine the private sector, what they go through if they had a brand new turbine they wanted to use, a more efficient turbine. They go through the permitting process to get it implemented or get it basically installed. You're talking years.
It is years, and it's a huge chilling effect in investment.
what recommendation, do any of you all have a recommendation how we could accelerate this?
So NHA does have a number of recommendations, a few are in our testimony. One of the most significant is that for those facilities that do not have significant environmental issues, so particularly closed loop or off-river pump storage facilities, where they're not on the river, not having that environmental impact, or non-power dams, where the existing infrastructure, the civil work already exists, we should have a streamlined permitting process, something within 2 years. You should not need a 7 or 10-year licensing process where you don't have those environmental impacts. The other critical...
If they're taking to court, I mean, the court actions go on for years and years.
That is true, which is why we need to have the permit conditions limited to things that are directly related to the facility. It's become an open-ended process for addressing everything in the basin. And tax incentives so that they can compete with other zero carbon technologies is also critical.
Is hydropower one of the lowest cost generators of electricity?
Absolutely. Particularly when you realize that the facilities can last 50 years, some of which are successfully operating over 100 years later, whereas wind and solar after 10 or 15 years need to be replaced. So the life cycle of hydropower makes it one of the best that exists.
It's a shame we haven't done more.
Agreed, Chairman.
Senator Brasso.
Well, I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate your line of questioning and your thought process on this. So I'd like to just ask all of the witnesses whether you believe hydropower is renewable energy, a clean source of energy, a sustainable source of energy, and it helps reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. Simple yes or no. Let's start, Mr. Wolf.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
The others?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So in light of all your answers to my first questions, I'd like to ask each of you about public and private sector financing of hydroelectric projects. Specifically, do you believe that these projects here in the U.S. should enjoy the same access to financing that other renewable energy sources enjoy? In other words, do you believe hydropower projects here in the U.S. Can and do meet what are known as environmental, social, and corporate governance, or the ESG standards? A simple yes or no, and let's start, Mr. Wolf.
Yes.
Mr. Corwin.
Yes.
The others.
Certainly, investments in hydropower within the private and public sector are of interest to reclamation.
Yeah, one more.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, all right. So, Mr. Corwin and then Mr. Wolf, the costs and timeline of licensing and relicensing hydropower project, it's burdensome on developers and more importantly on consumers. And the chairman made mention of this. A report by the Department of Energy released just a few months ago regarding the hydropower regulatory structure stated that, quote, the length and complexity of the licensing process is challenging for all stakeholder sectors. So, and I agree with the statement. I'd take it a step further because I think any regulatory regime that takes nearly a decade to license or relicense critical infrastructure projects is in need of reform. What reforms would the two of you propose to federal permitting, licensing, and the relicensing process? And maybe start with Mr. Corwin.
Thank you, Senator. And yes, that was a good report that also has points to some recommendations that way. The DOE and the labs have done some really good work in recent years along these lines on these issues. One thing I'd note in the example I used, the difference between regulating on the nuclear plant and the hydro plant is you had the NRC as the clear lead agency able to control the timelines and
To enforce those timelines, the other recommendation, so clearly establishing FERC as a lead agency, giving them authorization to control the timelines, requiring other agencies to use relevant existing studies and not duplicate studies on where you already have the work done. A lot of these are existing projects. We know what they do. And then resolving agency disputes in a timely manner by referral to to OMB and CEQ, and then allow trial-type hearings on these mandatory conditions so we can have resolution in a timely way.
And Mr. Wolf?
The role, I'd agree with Mr. Corwin, the role of state and federal resource agencies and tribal authorities needs to be respected, but so do the deadlines established by Congress. And so we need some process discipline in order to be able to make sure that the deadlines established are honored. And the second thing we need is to rein in the agency overrun. They are imposing requirements on our facilities that are not related to the facility's effects. building an amphitheater for the Boy Scouts, or feeding a third party's livestock. There are examples that have nothing to do with the hydropower facility that are becoming mandatory conditions, and that needs to be reeled in.
Thank you. Commissioner Tootin, so less than 3% of all the dams in the U.S. produce power. The Bureau of Rec previously identified about 200 dams that it felt suitable for hydroelectric development. What are the principal obstacles inhibiting the Bureau from installing turbines on its non-powered dams?
Good morning, Ranking Member. Thank you for that question. With regard to your question about process and permitting, between our administrative changes and our changes in federal statutes, we've been able to decrease up the processing time and increase interest, awarding our lease of power privilege contracts 70% faster. Certainly, it's investments from developers. Most of our hydropower is produced, or the interest is produced, by our stakeholders who operate and maintain those facilities. And so their ability to access capital to be able to develop all those are part of it. So we're working through that with them, recognizing the tremendous value of additional hydropower in existing federal facilities.
So the chairman asked about all of the money that was in the bipartisan infrastructure bill in terms of how that money, it's already been appropriated. Will the Bureau use that money to install turbines on some of the non-powered dams?
So one of the challenges that we have with our facilities, as I mentioned, is that it is aging. A significant portion of our money from the infrastructure law is for aging infrastructure. So certainly advancements and enhancements to our structures will also be of service and of use to hydropower development.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Wolf, as you know, legacy dams had a pretty devastating effect on salmon and steelhead populations in this country. So as we look to, one, build new dams, two, modify existing dams, and in some cases remove legacy dams, what do you see as some of the opportunities to avoid the fisheries impacts of the past, or for that matter, improve opportunities for recovering fish populations?
Thank you for your question, Senator. There's really not a whole lot of major new dams being built in this country. That ended generations ago, maybe 40, 50 years ago. So the real opportunities for growth now are in non-power dams, where dams already exist. Let's better use them for their carbon potential. And there's off-river or closed-loop pump storage. Neither of those have the kind of environmental impacts that we may have seen from the big dams of 100 years ago. There's also been tremendous innovation in environmental improvements in stewardship. There's fish-friendly turbines and fish bypass technologies that help ensure that migrating fish and others can survive. So this is not your grandfather's hydropower industry. We pride ourselves in being part of a climate solution and being sustainable.
I'll let Senator King speak to what he was able to do in Maine, but I know there was an example there where they removed a legacy dam that was no longer providing services, opening up an enormous amount of habitat to fisheries, and at the same time used that same moment to increase hydropower potential. So I think it's something we need to look more at, given just given how many fisheries we've lost in this country and the economic potential of recovering some of those. Ms. Tootin, you mentioned unprecedented drought, and I don't want to quibble with your language, but drought is a temporary condition. And there's substantial evidence that what we're experiencing right now in New Mexico and in other parts of the West, in the Colorado River Basin, in the Rio Grande River Basin, is maybe more accurately termed aridification. In other words, it is a permanent impact of the changing climate. We're simply not seeing the snowpacks and the precipitation that we used to see, and it doesn't look like it's coming back. So in your position, how do you change your hydropower operations in response to lower storage levels, lower overall precipitation, and what is effectively a dwindling supply in a number of these basins?
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for that question. As you mentioned, when we constructed these facilities over a century ago, it was on the premise that our biggest reservoir is snowpack. And that has significantly changed within the last few years, within the last decades, of how much snowpack we receive, and therefore how much water comes into our reservoirs. And so when you have low elevations coupled with low flow, that significantly impacts hydropower. So some of the things that we're doing are installing new technologies, new turbines that take advantage and that can operate at lower lake levels like we did at Hoover Dam. And certainly conservation efforts to keep more water behind our reservoirs helps with hydropower production. But we can't do this alone, and really look forward to working with our partners on how we continue to conserve water supplies, but also protect our hydropower resources.
Can you talk a little bit about the reductions in capacity that you have seen as a result of the changing climate, and what impacts those have on Western states' economies?
I'll speak specifically to Glen Canyon Dam because that's a good example. It's 27% of capacity, the lowest since filling, and we anticipate that this year we will generate the least amount of power since 1965 at the CRISP, Colorado River Storage Project facilities. And 1965 was when Glen Canyon came online. And so, a lot of the challenges that we're seeing is when your fuel is based on water, you need to be able to look at it from both a water supply and also a hydropower perspective on how you keep those reservoirs up to protect both of those resources.
New Mexico, actually for Mr. Wolf, New Mexico recently joined the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which we've seen Bonneville Power plans to join in, I think, this year, and WAPA joined in 2021. Are there opportunities to sort of to compensate hydropower's capability to play a greater role in maintaining reliability and balance on the grid?
Absolutely, and that's not currently being done now. Hydropower provides flexibility, provides spinning reserves, black start capabilities, and it's not properly compensated for providing those grid reliability services.
Whose job is it to figure out that market structure? Is that a FERC thing? Is that a Congress thing? Like, who should be focusing on creating a market to compensate those values?
Yeah, I think it goes to keeping the lights on, so it's all of our jobs, but it's in organized markets, it's these regional transmission organizations that has that primary responsibility.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. We have Senator Daines.
Chair Manchin, thank you, as well as to Ranking Member Barrasso. Montana is one of the largest hydropower producers in the United States. Hydropower provides nearly half of all the electricity generated in Montana. Hydropower provides clean, reliable, affordable energy. It's important we continue to increase hydro production as well as the jobs and the revenues that come from it. And that's why just yesterday I introduced the Sun River Hydropower Authorization Act, which will allow hydropower production on Bureau of Reclamation dams in the Sun River project, including the Gibson Dam near Augusta, Montana. In August of last year, when Greenfield Irrigation District, who operates the Gibson Dam, asked me to introduce legislation to authorize hydropower on the Sun River project, we got to work. The proposed project would create good jobs, high-paying jobs, generate $2 million per year for the irrigation district. It will also help bolster and sustain irrigation for the 750 farmers, ranchers, and water users in the region. This is a clear win-win. Commissioner Tootin, the Sun River project is under the Bureau of Reclamation. Could you explain how powering non-powered dams like the Gibson Dam helps generate jobs, revenue, and sustains irrigation?
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for that question. Greenfield Irrigation District is a great example of the types of partnerships we have in developing new hydropower at our facilities. In fact, they are a transferred work operator, which means they operate and maintain that project, and have developed small conduit hydropower, which roughly equivalent to $180,000 per year of revenue that they immediately use to pay for operation and maintenance and enhancement of that project. So we certainly see a benefit there, and look forward to working with you on your legislation.
Thank you for that. Mr. Corwin, The power produced at the Gibson Dam will run through the rural electric cooperatives in Montana. How will increasing hydropower help local Montana cooperatives as well as energy consumers?
Yeah, it's a great resource to add to any energy mix because of those qualities, emission-free and flexible. And I know there's also with that cooperative in Montana some synergies on being able to enhance the transmission lines needed as well. So I think there's a good win-win situation there.
Thank you. I'm really concerned, I'd say very concerned, about recent calls to breach hydropower dams on the Columbia and Snake River systems. The hydropower produced by these dams provides important, affordable, renewable energy to western Montana, and any breach of dams would negatively impact Montana. Mr. Corwin and Mr. Wolf, can you elaborate on why breaching hydropower dams harms communities, jobs, and puts strain on electric production and the reliability of the grid? Start with Mr. Corwin.
Thank you, Senator. Especially with that example specifically, you're talking about over 2,500 megawatts of total capacity, which is that flexible capacity we were discussing earlier, so critical to balancing the grid, and it has come in handy at times. It's about 1,000 average megawatts, which is enough to power on average a very large city like the size of Seattle. So there's a lot of, again, clean, flexible capability right there. You also, as I mentioned earlier, the other values economically and around the community tied to that specific part of the system for irrigation, navigation, recreation, a lot of benefits that are at stake there.
Mr. Wolf?
There may be circumstances where breaching non-power dams that no longer serve a purpose will make sense, but where you've got power dams that are providing power to the community, I think you have to answer a few key questions before, particularly for the Snake River. You've got nameplate 3,000 megawatts of carbon-free generation. So where are you going to get the replacement power? How is it going to be reliable? Because you can't do it with just wind, solar, or batteries. What's the economic impact on household rates? How are the communities that rely on those for jobs, for agriculture, and then the environmental impact? We know that climate change is the biggest threat to salmon in the region.
So when you take a look at the grid and power creation, power production, it's not about average, it's about peak. And according to recent projections, the Pacific Northwest may face shortages of power supply to meet peak load conditions if we breach hydropower dams that provide strong base load energy. That possibility becomes a reality, and Montana may see the rolling blackouts that we've seen happen in other states. Mr. Corwin, Mr. Wolf, how is hydropower important to meeting peak energy demands, and how could reducing baseload power like hydro and coal cause a shortage of power supply?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, as you know, you already have some of the coal plants scheduled to come offline, so you're already going to be down on that base load capability in the West. At the same time, you've got an interesting shape of peak loads, especially when it's real hot in the afternoon, big peak, just as the solar energy that's come online is coming offline in the evening. So we've already seen this where it's been right up against the edge in the Western interconnection. And hydropower being able to provide spinning reserves is incredibly important to be able to balance that at the peak, as you mentioned.
Mr. Wolf, I'm about out of time. I have to have your answer be brief. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sure. Hydropower is the dispatchable renewable. So given the resource constraints in the Pacific Northwest, it's essential to keep the lights on.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Manchin and Senator Barrasso, for this very important hearing. As the most hydro-reliant state in the union, I can tell you I could sit here all day and we could have a very broad discussion, but I really appreciate the witnesses mentioning the work that Senator Murkowski and I and Senator Wyden have been doing on hydro and the tax credits and how essential it is. I have a question for all four of you, and if you could just take, a minute, each of you, to answer, that would be great. Mr. Corwin, how important is it to have the direct pay option for any tax credit? And how essential is it to have municipal and cooperative utilities take advantage of the tax credit? Mr. Wolf, if you could talk about why the production tax credit specifically and what we need to do to keep that 38% of hydro pump storage capacity that's about to expire and expand, why that's so critical. Ms. Tootin, if you could, Commissioner Tootin, if you could talk about, my colleague was mentioning this arid issue. How important is it to get the aquifer recharge program going? What number should we be looking at to put into aquifer since we are having less snowpack? And how does that help the system? And Ms. Garson, what can we do? How are you looking at the value of hydro and integration into renewables with the grid, including pump storage?
Well, thank you, Senator. And once again, thank you for your work on this because it is very important. And the direct pay piece specifically is incredibly important. If the goal is to have a market-wide, industry-wide approach to promote and encourage investment in hydropower, which is sorely needed, and there's a long backlog, then making sure that the 30% of utilities that are consumer-owned are able to use that tool is important. Otherwise, you're missing a large piece of it. And in the state of Washington, as you know, it's a lot more than 30% that are consumer-owned. So very important to the effort of getting this work done on these projects to maintain this capacity.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, for championing the existing hydropower fleet. There is a now expired tax credit for new development at non-powered existing dams, but there are no tax credits to preserve and maintain the existing carbon-free fleet. So that's why the tax credit that you and Senator Murkowski have been championing is so critical to keep that fleet alive and operating. And we thank Senator Wyden for including a portion of that in the Build Back Better to encourage environmental investments in the existing fleet.
Ms. Tootin, Commissioner Tootin, sorry.
Good morning, Senator. As we see changing conditions across the West, we have to use all those tools. So thank you to you and Senator Risch for the inclusion of the aquifer storage program as part of the infrastructural law. Because if you are able to store it in the ground, that's less water that you might be relying on behind a dam and provides more stability within the region and certainly a benefit to Washington State. We're working through the specifics of that program now, and I'm happy to follow up with you and your staff as we finalize numbers.
So we're talking about more than tens of millions, right?
Perhaps, Senator, absolutely. There's certainly a demand.
Okay, Ms. Garson, how important is it to get all this integrated into the grid of the future, particularly as it relates to hydro and pump storage?
It's critical. We've been conducting analysis with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to better understand how much additional wind and solar
PNNL,
can be brought on.
At Pacific Northwest Laboratories.
Well, so we have PNNL is also helping us do an analysis about the alternative values of hydropower. So not just capturing how much electricity generation could we bring online, but what are the other values derived. PNNL is also working with us on our pump storage valuation analysis, which we actually applied to the Goldendale facility in the state of Washington to better understand and articulate the values of pump storage projects for developers to have better ease of access either to investment or to work with regulators to advance pump storage. So we're working on a myriad of analyses that show both the quantitative measures of additional variable renewable energy that could be brought online and to better articulate the entirety of the values, including recreation and economic benefits that hydropower provides.
And when will that be a national analysis?
So the alternative values analysis will be a national analysis. We're doing stakeholder engagement and workshops right now with PNNL and Idaho National Laboratory, and the evaluation project is already out and is available to developers nationwide for pump storage.
But Mr. Chairman, I think this will be so helpful to other states, both on, understanding the value that we can get out of hydro. It's just one more level of efficiency using pump storage. Thank you.
How much electricity do you get?
Well, we're at 62% right now of our electricity is generated by hydro. It's down a little bit from 70, probably 71 or 2% over the last decade or so. For us, that's not a bad idea, given the fact that we have challenges with the hydro system and less snowpack. So it gives us a little more
Has
flexibility.
any been closed because of relicensing or any of the FERC, or you have any challenges there?
Senator Craig and I, more than a decade ago, whenever Senator Craig was here, so it tells you how long ago it was, worked on a program on hydro relicensing that we got passed into law. Basically, it allowed the participants to come to the table and bring up issues earlier in the process because you have so many agencies that were participants. That way you didn't have, you know, two agencies agree and then now you get down the road and a third agency says, oh, I don't like this. So basically it allowed everybody to put their cards on the table early without penalty. And I think it was an improvement in the system, but certainly we could discuss more. And the fact that the tribes are willing to look at some of these issues, I think is a very important aspect of Mr. Wolf's work. If they're willing, you know, to discuss what is a smoother process. But obviously, these are huge resources in the Northwest. I mean, but I do think, and I don't know what all the other issues that Mr. Wolf could probably address, but I do think that it is an underused resources in general, but we also have environmental impact. So it's like you have to figure out all of this, and the best way to do that is to dialogue, get all those issues on the table early.
Senator Langford.
Senator Manchin, thank you. Senator Cantwell, I'd be glad to be able to partner with you to be able to look at some of those areas and the relicensing as well. I thank you for your work in the past on that. You know there are obvious issues on this as well. Oklahoma has 10 hydro facilities in Oklahoma, and that's a small dot of what you have in the Northwest for hydro facilities, but we use hydro as well, and it's been a good source of power. But our challenge has been the relicensing process. Actually, we have some of our facilities that took 5 years from when they first dreamed of doing it to when they were done with the construction. Those same facilities now going through relicensing, it's 8 years just to be able to relicense a facility that only took 5 years to build at the very beginning of it. And so there's been some real challenges, and some of that's been agencies don't follow FERC's guidelines. And it's one of the areas I want to be able to ask Mr. Wolf about as well, is that FERC will set a guideline of when agencies have to give a response, and agencies say, we'll give you a response when we feel like it, and are not following through on those timelines. And so giving agencies a set structure of when they have to actually respond would also be helpful, I think.
Okay, we're happy to work with you, Senator.
It'd be great. Glad to be able to do that. Mr. Wolf, let me come back to you on that. It is now longer to be able to relicense a hydro facility than it is a nuclear facility to be able to relicense. It's grown to be absurd in the process. What are the big rocks that you would look at that's really driving this very lengthy process for relicensing?
I think there's two big problems, one of which you just mentioned, which is there's no process discipline. State and natural resource agencies and tribes have critical roles, but if they don't abide by the congressional deadlines, there's no consequence. FERC can't do anything about it. There's no, you can't play football if everyone's a quarterback. The second challenge is that some of these resource agencies are going far beyond project effects. It's absolutely legitimate to require a facility to address the effects of the facility, but they see this as the only mechanism they have to address unrelated issues. And over the decades, it has gone to just absurd lengths.
So let me ask a more specific question on that as well. Do you have recommendations out there for what you would look at to say how you address this whole issue of some federal entities saying, I'm not going to follow the guidelines of FERC? FERC sets a timeline, other entities like, we'll do it when we feel like it, and it may stretch on forever. Is there some way to be able to do that you're making a recommendation on?
So I do have recommendations in my written testimony, but I'm excited to be able to say that we've been talking with the environmental and river community, and we hope to be able to bring a package of reforms to the Federal Power Act to this committee in February, hopefully in time to be able to move something in a bipartisan way this Congress.
That shouldn't be a problem. This Congress has been great at moving bipartisan things, so that shouldn't be an issue. Let me ask another issue on this. You bring up some of the other things that every time the relicensing happens, it seems to draw on every issue in the entire region in the process. That is a discouragement to doing additional hydro that's out there. We have 90,000 or so locations in the country that could do hydro, but only a fraction of them actually do. Do you see that as some facilities and locations would say, we don't want to go through and actually put hydro in this area because it also affects everything else in the area? Do you see that as an ongoing discouragement that should be addressed?
Absolutely. There's, particularly for low-hanging fruit, where the dam already exists, that doesn't have significant environmental impact, or off-river or closed-loop pump storage does not have significant environmental impact. So we're recommending a 2-year licensing process, start to finish, for those facilities, as they should not be that complicated.
So why do we see some of these locations that have additional capacity not actually expanding? That we see that in core areas, especially where there's additional capability, but not actually an expansion to add additional power. Why would that be?
Three reasons. First is the licensing process that they'd have to go through. The second is the lack of tax parity. They get incentivized to invest in other zero carbon technologies. And then third, the markets themselves. They don't get paid for the flexibility and the various grid reliability services they provide. So it's a real market failure.
Do we have an issue with just startup costs on this as well? Has anyone voiced that and said, okay, we just don't have enough money to be able to do that expansion, so we're just not going to do it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's all upfront costs because the resource is free. The water
Right.
is there. So it's all upfront startup costs, which is a challenge.
But obviously, it pays for itself over time, which is actually the income from that are coming in.
And these facilities last 50, sometimes 100 years. So they are amazing investments.
So do you see an issue that Congress needs to address how we handle the upfront cost and the payback on that? Because often in our appropriation process, we'll actually say, okay, if it doesn't pay for itself in a year, then we're not going to be able to do it. And so literally you don't allocate money to something when other bonds, other issues actually do pay for itself over time.
We need to think of hydropower as like other infrastructure, like bridges and roads. It shapes communities. It lasts for generations. We can't expect to finance it like a wind or solar project that are going to have a short lifespan.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, may I ask one additional question? I know I'm over time. I have this understanding, I heard this rumor as well, that you might be from Tulsa, Oklahoma.
I am
Is
from
that
Tulsa.
true or false?
That is true.
You still live in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
I do not, unfortunately.
There are homes for sale in Tulsa. You're welcome to be able to come back anytime. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to have, we have Senator King by virtual. Senator King, you still there?
I am. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want the record to show that I do have a tie on, but I'm wearing this sweater today in honor of my constituents in northern Maine. I talked to one this morning. It was 20 below zero absolute temperature and 39 below with the wind chill. So
You feel right at home here in this committee room right now.
Oh yeah, I just want to express solidarity to my constituents. First, I do want to emphasize, and I think it would be worth the committee's while to really do some work on pump storage. Storage is the key to a carbon-free energy future, and batteries, as we know, are an important part of that. But they involve mining and rare minerals and rare earth, all kinds of other issues, and a lot of technology to be developed. Pump storage is a clean alternative, and I think it's one that deserves some additional attention in terms of permitting and support in terms of tax credits and those kinds of things. Secondly, on the issue of permitting, an appalling 39 years ago, I began in the hydro industry as a lawyer working on permitting. And I've, in a sense, been waiting for this hearing for 39 years. And here are a couple of the issues. One is, I believe there needs to be a strong lead agency, and obviously that agency is FERC. But the important word is strong. And as Mr. Wolf has testified, they have to have the ability, and Congress has to have the ability to set deadlines and mean it, and have those deadlines mean something. This idea that it takes longer to permit a hydro project than a nuclear plant is absolutely preposterous. And so a lead agency, one-stop shopping, a lead agency that can control the process, can set reasonable deadlines, I think is incredibly important. The other thing that I observed at the time is that, and I suspect this is still true, that FERC is reluctant to make decisions when there are conflicts between agencies or between the developer and the agency. FERC basically says, go and work it out, and then we'll bless what you agree to. The problem is that creates a kind of veto power in various parts of the system. FERC really, I think, and maybe I'm behind the times and they're much better at this, but my sense is that FERC would rather have a settlement than make a decision. FERC has to be ready to make those decisions on a timely basis. Mr. Corwin, am I correct about that assumption?
Yes, that's a good description. Having their ability to make a strong decision and be the strong lead agency and hold to timelines would really change the process and make it a lot more manageable.
And Mr. Wolf, how about this? How about an expedited permitting process for repowering or powering existing dams that don't have power before? Because the ecological impact of that dam has already taken place, and the incremental environmental impact of powering that dam is insubstantial. Shouldn't we think about that as a special category that would be entitled to some kind of expedited permitting studies and those kinds of things?
Yeah, expedited permitting for existing non-power dams is a great idea. Great way to get more carbon-free generation on the grid.
And the dams are already there. The environmental impact of the dam has already taken place. One of the things that used to frustrate me was that when you're permitting a hydro project, it's treated as if it were a strip mall. And none of the, nothing that I have, not that I have anything against strip malls, but none of the environmental benefits are taken into account. Every form of energy has some impact. There's no free lunch in energy. But it seems to me that projects that have a substantial environmental impact should get some credit, if you will, for that gain to the environment. But often in a hydropower licensing situation, that's not the case. Mr. Corbin, do you agree?
I agree, and in that instance you use where there's already an existing dam, if you have the proponent of a license walk away because they can't get through the process, you haven't improved the environmental conditions in that area either. You still have the dam there. So.
One final question, and I know I'm at the end of my time, Mr. Chairman, but or a comment. One of the problems with developing hydropower is that it's capital intensive and fuel free, but it's competing against currently natural gas, which is a very low capital investment, probably a fourth or a fifth of what it costs to develop a hydropower project. But it has an energy cost, a fuel cost that goes out into the future. The market doesn't really recognize that now, and that's why I think I agree with Senator Cantwell. We need some special upfront incentives in order to try to get these capital-intensive projects, which will be there for 40, 50, maybe even 100 years. But right now they can't compete for capital because of the high demand up front. Mr. Wolf, is that your experience?
Absolutely, and it's particularly made more challenging if every other form of zero carbon technology is subsidized and hydropower is not. It makes it an impossible investment climate.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a worthy area for our attention. I thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Cortez Masto.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you both, Mr. Chairman, the ranking member, for holding today's hearing. As you all know, 100% of my state of Nevada is experiencing some level of drought, and in many locations across the West, the ability to generate electricity is incumbent upon the availability of water. So, Commissioner Tootin, let me start with you. Nevada is a beneficiary of water in the Colorado River Basin. In fact, over 2 million Nevadans get their water from the Colorado River. But despite only receiving 0.3 million acre feet of annual allocation out of the 16.5 million acre feet allocated across the basin, and that's the lowest of any Colorado River basin, Southern Nevada has been at the forefront of implementing conservation measures to help keep more water in Lake Mead for future water use, but also to keep enough water in the lake to generate electricity, which we've been talking about today. So, Commissioner, my question to you is, one, what should we be considering for those of us that utilize that water along the Colorado River, but also important for the electricity that is generated from the Colorado River? And could you also talk about, I understand you were in Las Vegas when the Colorado Water River Users Association came together and signed the agreement. I think it's referred to as the 500+ plan. there is a nexus between the drought that we're seeing and the electricity we want to generate through hydropower. So can you talk a little bit about that and what we need to be aware of and considering, and how that that work that we need to do is also important for us to bring the states into this conversation as well?
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto, and good morning. When you look at hydropower, there's two components to it. The elevation at the reservoir, or the head as we talk about, and the flow rate, or the amount of water that goes to the turbines. And what we're seeing in the Colorado River is record low capacities, so low head, and subsequently low water going through those turbines. So that has immediate impacts on hydropower production. And so the plan that you mentioned, a partnership with the Southern Nevada Water Authority in the state of Nevada, California, and Arizona, the 500 plus plan, says that we need to find within 2022 and 2023 500,000 acre feet, so a collective million acre feet of water, and prop up Lake Mead. So that helps on two fronts for hydropower. It helps keep levels up so we have a higher head, and certainly it helps with flow rates because you have more water behind the reservoir. And as we work with our partners, specifically our preference customers, and with the Western Area Power Administration, investments in new technology like low head help. But it really is looking at both the water supply, because it is the fuel, that helps to also answer our challenges with hydropower.
And Commissioner, you feel confident that the users along the Colorado River, particularly the lower basin states that you just talked about, everybody is in agreement and understands the necessity to come together to conserve that water?
Yes, not only are we in agreement, we have committed to significant financial resources. The Bureau of Reclamation has already found the $50 million of a $100 million cost share that we have with the states, and the states have gone to their boards and have brought those monies to bear as well. So we're ready to work.
And then the work that we did in the bipartisan infrastructure package, how does that benefit what we're talking about today?
First, there's a significant investments in there as part of the drought contingency plan, so thank you for that. And certainly the large-scale water recycling, which we're hoping to bring online soon, is another tool, because if you're developing water somewhere else, you're saving that water in a reservoir. And so there's direct correlations to conservation and efficiencies within the system that translates into more water behind reservoirs and therefore more generation capacity for hydropower.
Thank you. And so let me ask both Commissioner Tootin and Acting Director Garson, can you provide an update on current efforts and coordination with other agencies to address today's unique challenges and keep our dams and hydropower facilities safe? Concern around, obviously, cybersecurity and hacking. What work is being done to address this issue to make sure we're protecting that important piece of hydropower and electricity to our communities? And I'm happy, either Commissioner Tootin or Acting Director Garson.
I can go first, and perhaps on that, one of the significant partnerships we have is this federal MOU on hydropower. So it helps for us to coordinate both on the technological side, but also permitting, among other things. Reclamation has to remain vigilant as far as cybersecurity, and so we're continually working with DOE, we're working with the Army Corps, exchanging best practices, knowing that the bad actors are always there. And even when you feel like cybersecurity, you're at the forefront, you have to continually improve because they're getting better at going after our facilities.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in addition to the memorandum of understanding, we are working too with FEMA's dam safety program and trying to leverage some of the analysis and work that we have through HydroSource at our Oak Ridge National Laboratory to provide the analysis needed to inform an interagency working group that's really looking at the interconnection between cybersecurity and safety, of which they are obviously incredibly interrelated.
Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Now we have Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. This issue of hydropower is, critical to our state, but as we all realize, as Senator Cortez Masto spoke about, drought is drought in the West. This 22-year drought that we've been experiencing is connected with our ability to generate electricity, especially at the Hoover Dam. So, Commissioner Tootin, I wanted to follow up on the line of questioning that my colleague from Nevada had about the 500-plus plan that was finalized last month. As you and we all realize, this plan is going to help water users in Arizona, Nevada, and California conserve about 1 million acre-feet of water in Lake Mead through 2023, 500,000 acre-feet in 2022, and then again the following year. That's a lot of water, but it's not enough to prevent future drought restrictions. But it does buy some important time to deploy some more mitigation measures. And this matters because, as the senator from Nevada spoke about, Lake Mead is home to the Hoover Dam, which produces electricity for millions of people in Arizona and across the Southwest. Right now, as of today, if we were to check, I think the water level in Lake Mead is about 1,066 feet above sea level, but it's going down. If levels fall below 950 feet above sea level, the dam will stop generating electricity. That's about 116 feet from where it is today. So, Ms. Tootin, how soon does reclamation estimate that Lake Mead could reach this dead pool, reach the dead pool elevation, which is in the neighborhood of 800 and something feet? So the dam stops generating electricity at 950, but at 850 or so, I think, we wind up with a dead pool. We can't get any more water out of it. Do you have estimates for when those two things will happen?
So current modeling does not project Lake Mead to decline to dead pool, as you mentioned, Senator, within the next 5 years. And we see that there's a 3% chance that Lake Mead will decline to minimum power pool as early as 2026. That's certainly not to say that 1066 is not a scary number for us. It's certainly within the capacity of Lake Mead. That's about 34% of capacity. So we're at historically low levels at Lake Mead now.
And when earlier you mentioned that the drought contingency plan, there's funding from that, but there's also funding in the bipartisan infrastructure bill for the 500-plus plan. How much money can we use out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill at this point for the 500-plus plan?
So thank you to Congress. We were able to, within our FY21 reprogramming and supplemental funding for FY22, have cash on hand for the $50 million of $100 million for the 500-plus plan. So we're ready to work on that on that portion of it. We are currently finalizing our spend plan, Senator, and it's in review with the highest levels of the federal government, hopefully to get to you soon. But the $250 million there for the lower basin certainly will be one of the areas that we look for the additional $50 million for the 500-plus plan, which then leaves another $200 million for work within the basin.
And I want to talk a second, since my colleague from Colorado just arrived. Are upper basin states contributing resources in amounts similar to the 500-plus plan?
Well, we're currently working with our partners in the upper basin states. We Reclamation just announced changes and releases from Lake Powell throughout the year to be able to continue to protect levels at Powell. And we certainly have resources in hand to work with partners in the upper basin states when they're ready.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. This is a critical issue, not just for lower basin states, for upper basin states, for the entire Southwest, but for the country, in fact. This time of year especially, a large percentage, nearly all of the green leaf vegetables that people eat across the country come from the state of Arizona, from the lower basin. That water that comes from the Colorado River is critical for farmers to be able to grow that portion of our food supply. So I encourage you and the Secretary to continue to lean a little bit on the Upper Basin and all Colorado River states to work together on this critical issue. Apologies for going over my time, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Murkowski, you ready? Okay.
Appreciate the opportunity to be talking about hydropower and its extraordinary benefits. It is something that I think has been overlooked and is oftentimes just kind of the unsung. It just chugging along, making things happen. Certainly for us in Alaska, it's an extraordinary source of renewable, clean, environmentally safe energy. So I know that we need to be doing more to work to facilitate the build out around our country. In Alaska, we hear repeatedly the concerns from many of our smaller operators who feel almost overwhelmed with the permitting challenges, the licensing challenges, the length of the construction process. So I know that the legislation that Senator Cantwell and I have introduced has been commented on that would create the federal tax incentives to encourage the safety, the environmental, and really the resilience upgrades for our hydropower dams. So hopefully we'll be able to work with all of you and work with those in the administration to try to advance that and would basically put out an ask that as we are looking to again do more when it comes to our hydropower resources, that we can count on the agencies to really work to reduce these barriers to deploy more of our hydroelectric capacity, and certainly our smaller hydro. This is something that it seems to me we just haven't been able to talk openly about the different ways that we create energy through our hydropower. Not everything is a big Bonneville or a Hoover Lake. So much of it in my state is the small, the run-of-river projects. The Riv Jeton project that we have in Igiagik is a great little example of how you can take smaller solutions and make a big difference. When you take a village off of diesel, you are making an extraordinary difference in the quality of life and the sustainability of that community. So I want to make sure that we are doing just exactly that. I would hope that we can do more to demonstrate to the public that projects like this are safe, that they can be constructed without detriment to the environment, in many of our cases, without impact to our fisheries, and that's exactly what we're doing in Alaska. I want to get to my question here, and this is for Ms. Garson. In your testimony, you mentioned that in the Energy Act of 2020, Congress expanded the definition of qualified hydroelectric facility to include an existing dam or conduit constructed in an area of inadequate electric service as determined by the Secretary. The RFI that DOE released last July proposes to limit the definition by stating, quote, or where the cost of electricity is significantly above the typical residential electric costs. So what I have heard from folks back home is that with the inclusion of the word significantly, it departs from the law. It's really going to limit the program's reach in Alaska, where our typical residential electric rates are generally higher than the lower 48. So I would like your commitment to work with me and my office to ensure that the final rulemaking here is not so overly restrictive that it shuts out many of the communities that I believe it's intended to support. So I'd like your commitment that we can work on that.
Yes, Senator. And there are actually 3 different qualifications for inadequate electric service. One is lack of access to an interconnected transmission system, which Alaska is not connected to the Eastern or Western Interconnect or ERCOT. So in our interpretation, Alaskan communities and Alaskan projects, nearly all, if they meet the other qualifications, would be eligible under 242. But I'd be happy to meet with you and discuss more about our implementation and our rulemaking process.
Good. Well, I would welcome that. I'd look forward to that. In the meantime, Mr. Chairman, I want to submit for the record comments from the Alaska Independent Power Producers Association, the Renewable Juneau, and Juneau Hydropower. They were submitted in response to the RFI from the Department of Energy. But again, everything that this committee can do to work on the permitting issues, the licensing issues, the cost issues, the length of time, this is going to be extraordinarily important. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to work through this Congress to get this this provision that Senator Cantwell and I have been working on. I think that will be a big step forward. So I'm getting lots of good positive nods from our witnesses, and hope that those of you that are appearing virtually today can note the enthusiasm for the direction that we're taking. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank all of you for your work on this. Thank you, Chairman, for bringing together this panel. And now that my esteemed colleague, Senator Kelly, has left, and I can talk a little real truth about the lower basin states, how this is going to resolve. I'm just kidding. We have had frequent constructive conversations on the challenges we're going to be facing. Commissioner Tootin, given that this whole, the projections demonstrated the very legitimate and real possibility that Lake Powell is going to go below the minimum level required to produce power under possible hydrologic scenarios, literally possibly as early as next winter. And I am happy to report that the mountains in Colorado are about 30 or 40% above average, which is a great data point, but it's only a data point. I wanted to see if Commissioner, you could talk a little bit about how the Bureau of Reclamation, when you're looking at how do you avoid this sort of a situation where we have clearly very serious negative outcomes, and at what point do you go to trying to prepare for those situations, and at what point do you begin to, where's the inflection point where you begin to focus on more prepare or dealing with rather than avoiding?
Thank you, Senator. Good morning. Certainly, I think we're at the point where we're doing both. The levels at Lake Powell, we are operating in conditions that we've never operated before since the construction and bringing online this facility. And so first things we did that we announced last week was we adjusted the releases from Powell. The volume stays the same of how much goes out, but how much we varied it between months to be able to protect, as you said, critical times in the power pool. So that's step one, but that is a lot more to do. And certainly one of the things that we're doing to prepare is as part of our supplemental funding, we've allocated funds to look at the operations of the facilities under these dry conditions to better understand them and how we can move forward should these continues persist. We're very happy about the snow, but as you said, it's one data point. It's like, not getting money into your bank account for a year and then all of a sudden getting a paycheck for a month. So we're at still extreme deficits, but we're not going to complain about getting more snow.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. It is about maybe it's 2 paychecks, but not anything that's going to solve our problems. Mr. Wolf and Ms. Garson, as you know, we're poised for a remarkable build-out of clean energy, especially in wind and solar in the coming decade. And I think hydro can play a critical role in that build-out and be a big part of the clean resource mix, all the more so because it does complement wind and solar in certain key respects in terms of generation and storage. Can you discuss a little bit about how that complementary relationship really does help other renewable energy sources as wind and solar begin to grow. I don't know who you want to go first.
I'll jump in. We think of hydropower as the renewable resource that enables other renewable resources. One example of this is just in California. Even during the recent drought, hydropower is able to ramp up in those afternoon periods. As the sun is setting, hydropower ramps up to keep the lights on. So we really view hydropower as providing an essential complement to the other clean energy technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to add something to that, Ms. Garson?
Yes, I will say that one of the things that we're actually doing with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado is looking at specifically the integration factor that could be enabled by hydropower. So specifically quantifying how much additional solar or wind could you have either at a national or localized level by having hydropower serve in a more flexible operating environment to provide load balancing and other critical grid services.
Great, and I appreciate that shout out for NRAIL. National Renewable Energy Laboratory is something we're very proud of in Colorado. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on some of these issues regarding Lake Powell. I'm very worried about what the ongoing drought in the West has done, and particularly on the impact that it's had on Lake Powell. Current water level readings at Lake Powell are only 10 feet above the critical threshold that has been set to protect power production capabilities at Glen Canyon Dam. And according to the most recent 24-month analysis by the Bureau of Reclamation that was released just a few weeks ago, those water levels are projected to cross that critical threshold by March of this year and then continue to decline over the next year. And so, Mr. Corwin, I've been worried about this. What can you tell me, what steps do you think federal agencies or WAPA could take in order to ease transitions for customers if power generation continues to, if our ability or our power generation capacity there continues to fluctuate?
Well, near term, and I'd defer to WAPA, the experts on how they'd approach their planning, and the Bureau of Reclamation on the state of the projects. But you know, diversifying your supply and your contracts is you know, is critical in that instance. And I think you know, hydropower generally, for one thing, being able to create mechanisms to bring more into the area, because to balance that region is critical as well. So there's a lot of different steps. Some of it involves transmission capability as well, that I know they're looking at to try to ameliorate that.
Okay. Mr. Corwin, you may be aware that the BLM establishes solar energy zones as areas well suited for utility scale production of solar energy, where the BLM will prioritize solar energy and associated transmission infrastructure development. Do you think similar steps could be taken by federal agencies in order to address and incentivize pumped hydro storage?
Certainly, there's potential for that. Anything you do to make the process easier and to create some incentive for investors and developers to make it actually happen, to get to the extent the zone helps get you through some of that permitting and process easier, that could help.
So that could be helpful in that way to hydropower generation.
Yeah, I hadn't looked at that for pump storage, but I think it's good that the concept has potential, certainly.
Yep. Mr. Wolf, you mentioned in your testimony that, quote, the time, cost, and uncertainty involved in licensing and relicensing an existing hydropower facilities diametrically at odds with the urgency of addressing climate change and the upcoming wave of hydropower relicensing proceedings. What steps do you think Congress can take to lighten the licensing burden while upholding the statutory objectives that we have set to consider water quality, species protection, cultural resource impacts, and recreation?
I think there's two fundamental problems. The first is lack of process discipline. There's no one agency is responsible for the process, and particularly if state or federal natural resource agencies don't do their jobs under the required deadlines, there's no consequences. And there's no decision maker, no dispute resolution process. The other problem is that some of these agency mandatory conditions run amok. They're going way beyond what is related to the effects of the facility. So if we could rein in those two problems, I think we could have a much more rational system that still respects environmental concerns and still involves the resource agencies and tribes and others. In fact, I mentioned earlier that we've been working closely with the environmental community and tribes, and we hope to be able to come back to this committee in February with a legislative reform package to address a lot of these challenges.
Wonderful, including the regulatory systems run amok related problems.
Correct.
Do you think these are fixable and fixable in a way that could take into account these interests that we've previously identified as significant?
I think they are fixable, and they need to be fixed if the industry is going to continue.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wolf, if a significant number of the hydropower facilities elect to decommission rather than renew their license, what would be the reliability and affordability impacts on consumers?
It could be dramatic. We are facing a wave of relicensing proceedings over the next decade. And these facilities not only provide clean power, they're dispatchable. So they are often the ones that keep the lights on as you've got increasing amounts of variable wind and solar. So it could be significant.
All right, and my next two questions related to Senator Lee's question, and I think you answered that on the things that should be done to improve the process. So I'm going to go to Mr. Corwin. When it comes to renewals for existing dams as well as permits for new projects, what steps do you feel should be taken to address the challenges so that the permitting process is improved? And I think Mr. Wolf touched on his thoughts there, but I'd like to hear yours.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And I mentioned earlier some of the basics, like getting a clear lead agency to hold to the other agencies to timelines, the clear lead agency being FERC, to not do redundant studies and duplicating studies. One thing, though, that mentioned in the report that that DOE or NREL did, they noted, too, that you have a lot of staff turnover, that mid-project, they're trying to rebuild technical expertise in the middle of a project review, and that can hold things up. There's disagreements over scientific data. There's waiting times on studies coming from these resource agencies. There's just a lot of different parts and pieces that could be addressed. It's just not been done to date. So.
Okay. Should an expansion of hydropower be included in the discussion? An expansion.
Yes, I think that there's a lot of opportunities for expansion, including just better, more efficient use even at current projects. And some of the work at the Department of Energy labs has highlighted that as well. As our technological advances and data increase, you can expand even just by operating more efficiently. But expansion, certainly at non-powered projects right now, there's a lot of opportunity. And we mentioned earlier, tens of thousands of projects where there's potential. So.
Okay, well then that leads me to Commissioner Touton. Do you see an opportunity for expanded hydropower development at Reclamation's existing facilities?
Yes, Senator. Our hydropower strategic plan outlines some of those opportunities within our facilities.
Okay, and are you working on that?
We absolutely are.
All right, then Director Garson, do you also believe that the current licensing process involves too many agencies?
That's not the discretion of the Department of Energy, but we have been providing third-party analysis specific to the timelines associated with the regulatory process, and our findings have been published just this past October, detailing the multiple steps that hydropower licensing and relicensing requires.
Then to ensure hydropower remains an important part of our energy mix, do you agree the permitting process needs to be streamlined?
I think to address some of the challenges articulated by Mr. Wolf and Mr. Corwin, there could be efficiencies, but again, the U.S. Department of Energy isn't necessarily involved in the regulatory process, but we'd be happy to meet with your staff to discuss our regulatory study.
Do you have recommendations, specific recommendations to alleviate burdensome permitting costs and delays?
I do not. The study instead articulates where some of the challenges might lie, but the Department of Energy does not provide recommendations how to streamline the permitting process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back the rest of my time.
If you all have any more questions, Senator Lee? Senator Hoven, do you have any other? I just have one follow-up and then we'll adjourn. Has there been rate increases to the customers with these water conditions we have out west? How are you able to maintain how are we able to maintain the revenue that's needed, even for the repairs, just the maintenance and repairs, if the revenue's down because of the rate increases, or maybe rate increases haven't happened? I don't know. Mr. Corwin? You know?
Yes, there have been rate increases over time in the wholesale power costs, and some certainly associated with not just the increased cost of the licensing and the maintenance,
right,
but also the operations and lack of ability to make use of the capability of those projects.
Is it going to be difficult with the reduction of water to maintain the rates, or can you continue to raise the rates or adjust the rates that'll be needed to keep the operations up to par?
Difficult to say with water conditions year to year. There's a lot of different factors impacting rates as well. There's increased costs for cybersecurity, for transmission, maintenance, and build. There's environmental considerations. So there's a lot of impacts to those customers, residents, and businesses in the West.
I've got one final question. There's a gentleman, Charlie Jones, who passed away a couple of years ago. Charlie was about 100 years of age in West Virginia. He was a tremendous individual, and he was as sharp and bright as could be. Charlie had a plan basically to build a very large pipeline from the water basin that we have in West Virginia in our pools down in Paducah, Kentucky. I mean, there's areas of water to build a pipeline to the west for water. Has that ever, I mean, we've got to do something to make sure you have adequate water supply, and we've got an abundance of water on the East Coast here, and especially in the basin that we have. And we share with Kentucky in this basin, and he did all the calculations on it and has all the drawings and everything, and I was just wondering, has that ever been a consideration?
I'd say, historically, I don't know about going that far, but even trying to move it longer distances around the West, it's been looked at over the years. But boy, if you think permitting at one little project can be difficult, trying to put in that type of infrastructure and the cost on it is pretty.
Well, I'm sure the cost and all that would be, but I just was wondering if the environmentalists would be opposed to a water pipeline.
I'd say the siting permitting would be extremely challenging.
Yeah, I've done that discussion.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that if we did something like that, we ought to peg the water to the price of a barrel of oil?
Well, we ought at least, I can tell you one thing, we like to get paid for our water in West Virginia. So I don't think we'd be quite as expensive as oil, but we get a pretty penny for it. Senator King, do you have any further follow-up? Any questions?
No, Mr. Chairman, but thank you again for this hearing. I think it's a very important one, and I think we've had some good ideas here and some things we can act upon.
I think we've taken it for granted just for far too long on hydropower and not really paying attention to it and developing it the way it should be developed. It has a tremendous opportunity, and we have an opportunity, and now with reducing our footprint, our carbon footprint, it'd be tremendous to have the reliable power that we know can do the job and has done it. Technology, I don't know if technology has been keeping up with it or if we put enough emphasis on that, on additional technology for hydro production of power, but it's something we should do.
Mr. Chairman, one of the tremendous resources we identified today was the dams, the thousands of dams that don't have any power generation.
Absolutely.
And I think we should look into some kind of expedited permitting process similar to very small hydro projects at FERC to enable us to enable the country to move forward tapping that resource. I think that's one of the most important things we've learned in this hearing today, and we need to figure out how to facilitate that development in areas where the environmental impact has already taken place.
With all of your assistance, maybe we can, our most able staffs on, for Renee and Richard's working with you all to get an update on where we stand on these and what potentials there is. I think the most logical, reasonable one and cost-effective ones. Which dams would you target if you were going to put hydro on? That would help us tremendously. Narrow it down to the ones that could be done. If you can help us with that, we appreciate it. So I want to thank all the witnesses for joining us this morning for the discussion. It's been quite informative, as you can tell by the questions been asked. Members will have until the close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. With that, the meeting will be adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.